Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Swanee, and for today's video, I'm going over all of the brand new stratagem changes that came in the latest patch, patch 1.000.400. Now the patch was released last Thursday, so I apologize for this video getting released so late, but there was just a ton of stuff that needed to be tested, and I've been playing and recording pretty much non-stop since the update came out, and there was just so much to test that I just couldn't get this video out any sooner. And in my previous video, I tested out all of the brand new primary weapon changes, so if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend you go check out that video. And I know that today's video is pretty long, so I went ahead and put timestamps down in the description, so if there's a specific stratagem that you want to skip ahead to, or if you have to take a break and maybe come back and watch the video later, the timestamps are there for your convenience. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So the first stratagem change that I want to talk about in this video is one that people have been waiting months for, and it's the FAF-14 Spear fix. In the patch notes, it says the FAF-14 Spear targeting has been reworked and should now function much better. However, it has lost the ability to target automaton spawners. This is not intended and will be fixed in the future. And that's not the only thing that can't be targeted. I also tried testing it out against some of the cannons, and I could not get it to lock on to some of the cannons in the environment. So unfortunately, the Spear isn't fully fixed yet, and it's going to take a little bit more tweaking. But when it does decide to work, I will say though that it locks on a lot faster, and overall it is a lot better than it was previously, especially when it comes to like taking out the gunships. In this latest update, they added random gunship patrols, so there's just constantly gunships that will just fly around in the environment, and they can be just super annoying. I'm not a big fan of this change because if you don't have something on you that can take out the gunships, you're basically just screwed. And the Spear is just absolutely amazing at taking out the gunships, but outside of the Spear's targeting, the Spear is pretty much exactly the same. It still does a ton of damage, and it's really good when it comes to like taking out tanks and stuff. So if you were like me and you just completely avoided the Spear, I can happily confirm that the Spear is at least usable now, and in my opinion, it's probably one of the best anti-vehicle stratagems in the game. So after this update, the Spear definitely has my seal of approval, and it comes with me on most of the automaton missions now to deal with those annoying gunships. So up next is the M105 Stalwart. It surprisingly received a small buff where they increased the projectile damage against durable body parts from 10% to 23%. Now, I was already a big fan of the Stalwart. It was one of my go-to weapons for the Terminids. It just wrecks everything. And one of my favorite things about the Stalwart is that it has such a large magazine size where you can just hold down the trigger and spray, and it feels like you can kill so many bugs before you have to reload. So the Stalwart was already good, and now they buffed it 13% to the durable body parts. So anytime you aren't landing a critical hit to like their face or their head or one of their weak body parts, if you miss and hit one of their durable body parts, it's going to do more damage. And I personally am constantly switching this thing's rate of fire. Sometimes I put it on the slower rate of fire so I can take my time and make my shots more accurate. And then if I'm getting swarmed, I'll just crank this thing's rate of fire up to full blast and just hold down the trigger and just mow everything down. And with that 13% extra damage increase, I could tell a pretty big difference. And the Stalwart is just amazing. I can't recommend it enough. And even when I went up against the automatons, the Stalwart technically only has light armor penetrating, but because you can fire off so many shots, I was still melting through things like Devastators with ease. Just aim at a Devastator's face and spray as many shots as you want, and you'll eventually take them out. So overall, the M105 Stalwart is better against both the automatons and the Terminids. So if you haven't yet, go check out the Stalwart, especially against the Terminids, and trust me, you're going to have a ton of fun. So next up is the MG43 machine gun. So this is kind of the middle ground machine gun. It's stronger than the Stalwart, but it's not as strong as the heavy machine gun. And a lot of people have been sleeping on this machine gun when compared to the Stalwart, and that's why it received a bit of a buff in this update. According to the patch notes, they decreased the reload time from 4 to 3.5 seconds, which is pretty noticeable. They increased the max amount of magazines from 3 to 4, which has also made a pretty big difference. They increase the projectile damage from 80 to 90, and then they increase the projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5% to 25%. So the MG43 machine gun received a pretty big buff, and honestly this machine gun feels way better. This went from being one of the stratagems that I would just never consider to actually being a pretty reliable option. I noticed a pretty big difference against both the Terminids and the Automatons. I was able to melt through some of the Automatons with ease, especially those Berserkers with the chainsaw arms that get right up in your face and they can just take tons of hits. I was just cutting through them like butter with this thing. It felt really, really good against the Automatons. And then of course against the bugs, it can just break their heads in just a couple of shots. So it's really good against those medium tier bugs. It's really good against taking out the spewers if you shoot them in the face. And it can really quickly take out the brood commanders and the stalkers. I even had success at taking out the charger's butts. If you hit it with a stun grenade, run behind the charger and just unload into the charger's butt, it makes quick work of a charger. And even though this machine gun received a pretty decent buff, it's still honestly probably going to sit on the shelf for me. I still like the Stalwart way better. And up next I'm going to talk about the heavy machine gun changes, and I feel like the heavy machine gun kind of overshadows the MG43 machine gun now. So the MG43 machine gun definitely got way better. Don't get me wrong, it's just if I had to choose one of the three, I'm either going to go with the Stalwart or the heavy machine gun. I'm not really going to go with this one. I will say though that if you ever come across the MG43 machine gun just lying around in the environment, definitely pick it up. Before this update, anytime I found this weapon in the environment, I would just ignore it and just move on. And since the update, I've stumbled across this weapon a couple of different times in the environment. I picked it up in a pinch, and it saved my life a number of different times. So I would say it went from being just kind of average to actually being really good now. It's just, in my personal preference, I'm going to pick one of the other two. But let me know what you guys think of this new machine gun change down in the comments. So moving on, let's talk about the MG206 heavy machine gun. Now the changes that they made were that they increased the projectile damage from 100 to 150. They increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 23% to 33%. They decreased the rate of fire from 450, 750, 900 to 450, 600, and 750. They decreased the reload time from 7 to 5.5 seconds, and then they increase the stagger strength. And honestly, this is a night and day difference for the heavy machine gun. Before this update, everybody just shat all over the heavy machine gun. It was not a popular choice. The slow reload time and the fact that it can only hold 75 rounds before you have to reload was just killer for this weapon. So it going from 7 seconds to 5.5 seconds to reload is a massive difference, and it can get you back into the action a lot quicker than it could previously. Now, I'm still not a big fan of it only holding 75 rounds. I'm still hoping that they eventually add like an ammo backpack for this thing, because only having 75 rounds, it still feels like you're burning through that ammo pretty quickly. But let's talk about those damage buffs that this thing received. This heavy machine gun went from being awful to amazing really quickly. I was just shredding through medium tier enemies like the brood commanders or the spewers, even the devastators. It will just completely cut the devastators in half. Even when you go up against the Hulk, just a couple of shots to the eye of a Hulk will completely annihilate it. Same goes for the chargers. Using the stun grenade against the chargers, running around and shooting them in the butt will take out their butts in just a couple of seconds and then just wait around for them to bleed out. The heavy machine gun now makes quick works of cannons and tanks, anything with a heat vent. And one of my favorite things is that it can take out the gunships. With them adding random gunship patrols, you see gunships pretty much every match you play against the automatons now. And if you shoot the gunships and the thrusters, it can take them out in just a couple of seconds. And one of the best parts is that it can even take out Bile Titans. You heard that right, in just a couple of shots, it will blow out the bile sacs out from underneath of it, and then if you keep shooting the underneath back part towards its butt, it will eventually completely kill the Bile Titan. So this MG206 heavy machine gun definitely packs a crazy punch now. It can kill every single enemy that you come across fairly quickly. So after this update, I feel like the heavy machine gun actually feels like a heavy machine gun, and I really enjoy it now. I feel like this can fit in pretty much any loadout, and the MG206 heavy machine gun gets a thumbs up from me. So the next stratagem that got changed on this list is the AX/AR-23 Guard Dog. Now this is the regular Guard Dog. This isn't the rover that shoots the laser beams. This is the one that shoots the AR-23 assault rifle, and they increase the projectile damage against durable body parts from 10% to 23%. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this thing is still awful. It's not good. Now I did notice the damage increase, like it was killing things easier than it could previously. That part's fine. The problem is that it runs out of ammo after killing like 2, maybe 3 enemies. It feels like this thing is constantly reloading. And then once it runs out of ammo completely, you have to go and find a supply crate to replenish its ammo to get it to continue fighting for you. Versus the other Guard Dog, the Guard Dog Rover, that shoots a laser beam. It gives you a continuous rate of fire. It will basically just keep shooting until everything's dead. You don't have to worry about reloading it or it finding ammo. The other Guard Dog is just miles better than this one. They're going to have to seriously rethink the way that this thing is designed for anyone to consider using it. I tried it against both the automatons and the Terminids, and the result's basically the same. Like, it will do an okay job at killing the small things, but it really struggles when it comes to facing the larger enemies. For example, the Devastators. It just doesn't know where to shoot at the Devastators. It won't shoot at their face, it'll just shoot at their armor, and all of the bullets will just ping off of the Devastators. But yeah, honestly, like when I was using it against the Terminids, it would kill maybe 3 Hunters if I was lucky, and then it would go and reload, and then it would reload for like 3 or 4 seconds, come back out, kill maybe 1 or 2 more Hunters, go back and reload. So this thing did receive a damage buff, but I still can't recommend using it until they change the way that the ammo works for this Guard Dog, because honestly, I think this stratagem is just absolutely garbage. So up next is a quick change, but it's to the Quasar Cannon. The intense heat and extreme cold environmental modifiers will now affect the Quasar Cannon's reload speed and will show correctly in the HUD. So I can confirm that the HUD is now accurate. Before this update, it was glitched and it wasn't. And it is accurate depending on what planet you're on, and I can notice a pretty massive difference. It says it's only 2.5 seconds, but it feels way shorter and way longer than that. When I was on the colder planets, it was recharging fairly quickly, and it felt like the original Quasar Cannon back before they nerfed it, and it had a pretty fast cooldown. And then when I was on a hot planet, it felt like ages before this thing cooled down. So this is a change that made sense for the Quasar Cannon since it is a laser weapon. I definitely recommend the Quasar Cannon on cold planets now, and I would avoid it like the plague on the hot planets because that slow recharge time just feels like forever on those hot planets. It's definitely noticeable. Don't take this thing on hot planets, you're gonna regret it. So up next is another quick one, and it completely overhauled this stratagem. It's the E/MG-101 HMG Emplacement turret. Now this is another stratagem that I didn't see get used very often, and it's one that I never saw anyone bring up in the community either, and it's probably because it was so slow. But it received an increased rotation speed by 100%, and that made a huge difference for this stratagem. It is so much more fun to use now. You can spin around a lot quicker. So if enemies are rushing you, or if they're flanking you and trying to come up from behind, you can easily turn now and take out enemies that are trying to flank you, versus before, if an enemy came up from behind, you were basically just screwed. So I like to use this at extractions. It's really good at extractions when you have just tons of enemies getting thrown at you. And trust me, if you haven't tried it yet, you have to test this stratagem out now. It's just way better than it was before, and I definitely think that you guys are going to like this change. So up next, I want to talk about all of these sentry changes that happened in this update. Now, some of the sentries got a little bit more attention than others, which I'll get to, but all of the sentries received this buff where they increase the durability from 0% to 80%. So this includes the autocannon sentry, the mortar sentry, the EMS sentry, the machine gun sentry, the Gatling sentry, like you get the picture. And after my testing against both the automatons and the Terminids, I can say that it does make a little bit of a difference. They can withstand a couple more hits if they're getting attacked by the smaller stuff, but let's say for example you're facing the Terminids and there's chargers. The chargers can still one-shot kill all of the turrets. Bile Titans can still one-shot kill the turrets. Rocket Devastators and tanks and hawks, they'll all make quick work of the turrets. So honestly, it feels like they got a little bit of a buff, but you still have to place these sentries in a very strategic position. Otherwise, they're just going to blow up pretty instantly. There was a bunch of different times where I hit the record button because I was trying to get footage footage of these turrets in action, and as soon as I hit the record button, I swear the turret would like spawn in and then it would immediately die. So yeah, in some cases I could tell a little bit of the durability increase. When they were getting attacked by the smaller Terminids, they were able to withstand a couple more hits, but anytime I threw out one of these sentries out in the open against like the automatons, they would just shoot it with rockets and blow it up. So in the future, I would honestly like to see these turrets get buffed even more with the durability, because it just really sucks when you spawn them in and they immediately get destroyed. So now let's talk about some of the individual sentries that got changed. So to start us off, let's talk about the A/MG43 machine gun sentry. Now this is the default sentry that people get as soon as you start off the game, and after the very beginning of the game, it kind of becomes obsolete once you're a mid to late game player. And the devs took note of this, they heard the complaints in the community, everyone wanted this thing to get a buff, and they buffed it. So they increased the projectile damage from 80 to 90, they increased projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5% to 25%, so that's a pretty big jump. They reduced the cooldown from 180 seconds to 120, which is also pretty huge. And then like I mentioned before, they increased the durability from 0 to 80%. Now as for my thoughts for this sentry, I would say it definitely got better. It's still not amazing. It's still not one that I would pick on the regular. The problem is that the Gatling Sentry was always better than this machine gun sentry, and they also buffed the Gatling Sentry, which I'm going to talk about next, and it's always kind of overshadowed this machine gun sentry. I could definitely tell a bit of a damage increase. It was doing a pretty good job at taking out some of the smaller enemy types. It was kind of pooping on a lot of the smaller bugs, but the main benefit here is that reduced cooldown from 180 seconds to 120 seconds, so you can call this machine gun sentry in fairly often. It was to the point where I could call this in close to every engagement I encountered. So for example, when I was facing the automatons and I was like going around blowing up the factories as like little side objectives, I'd blow up a factory, and by the time I cleared out that area and moved on to the next factory, I could already call in another machine gun sentry to help me out. So I'd call in one of these sentries, it would draw some of the fire and help take care of some of the ads, or if they called in reinforcements, this sentry would help take care of those reinforcements coming out of the bot drop, and I could worry about blowing up the factories. Then I'd move on to the next factory or the next objective. This thing would already be cooled down, and I could call it back in and it would help defend me. So it's not amazing in terms of damage, but it is nice to have some additional firepower, especially if you're a solo player, and the fact that you only have to wait 2 minutes to call this thing in is pretty nice. It's for sure way better than what it was before, and I would say it's probably worth bringing on a couple missions. So the next sentry that got some changes is the AG-16 Gatling Sentry, which has always overshadowed the previous sentry. Now for the Gatling Sentry, they increased the projectile damage from 80 to 90, they increased the projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5% to 25%, and increased the durability from 0 to 80%. Now the Gatling Sentry has always been a pretty good option, and both of the damage buffs that this thing received has made it even better. This is honestly my go-to sentry right now when it comes to dealing with the Terminids. That brand new mission type they just added where you have to call in the drill and you have to defend the drill, and pretty much any of the defense mission types, this is going to be a good stratagem to bring along for those defense missions. This Gatling Sentry was absolutely melting through the Terminids for me. I was testing it out on a couple different difficulties. It does struggle on the higher difficulties when there's things like chargers and stuff that can blow it up, but if you're playing on difficulties around 5 to 7, it does a pretty great job. I was getting like 30 plus kill streaks with this Gatling Sentry before it would either run out of ammo or eventually get overwhelmed and destroyed. Now it didn't get a reduced cooldown time, so it still has a cooldown time of 180 seconds, but that's the trade-off for getting some additional firepower. In my personal opinion, I still think that this Gatling Sentry is better than the Machine Gun Sentry, and overall it feels like the buffs that this thing got were pretty significant. The next Terminid defense mission you go on, bring this thing with you and test out for yourselves. I don't think you're going to regret it. So the final sentry on this list is the A/MLS-4X Rocket Sentry. They decreased its spread, they made it prioritize larger targets, they increased the target distance from 75 meters to 100 meters, they decreased rockets per salvo from 2 to 1 to get better ammo economy, they increased the explosion radius from 1 meter to 4 meters, they decreased the explosion armor penetration so explosions can no longer damage heavily armored enemies, and they stated that this projectile still has enough AP to damage heavily armored targets, and then they increase projectile damage from 200 to 300, and then lastly they increase the durability from 0 to 80%. And before this update, I thought that the Rocket Sentry was pretty bad. It had nothing on the autocannon sentry, and this thing just really underperformed, so I'm glad to see that it got all these buffs. And after testing it out in a number of different matches, if you manage to put it in a spot where it can't get destroyed, this thing will kick some butt. It can take down gunships, it can take out Hawks, it can take out Bile Titans if it's able to last long enough to get off enough rockets, and it can also destroy Factory Striders if that's pretty much its only target. So it can destroy any enemy in the game, it just has to stay alive and prioritize its targets. But I mostly use it against patrols and stuff. Like if I encountered a patrol or if enemies called in some reinforcements, I would just throw this thing down and it would just wreck everything. I can definitely tell a pretty big difference with the rocket's damage, especially against those heavily armored targets. And I would say that this is a pretty good option to bring along with you now, especially if you're a big fan of the autocannon sentry. This is a pretty good alternative. So overall, I really enjoy the changes that they made to the rocket sentry. Now it's actually usable when before it just wasn't worth bringing, so the Rocket Sentry definitely gets a thumbs up from me. So next up, I'm going to include both sets of the mines, the MD6 anti-personnel minefield and the MD14 incendiary mines. The anti-personnel mines got an increase to their explosion damage from 250 to 350, and the incendiary mines got an increase to their explosive damage from 150 to 210. Now, I tried to test these against both the Terminids and the Automatons, and both of the minefields kind of suck against the automatons. It's really hard to get a large group of automatons to follow you into a minefield. I tried dropping off the mines in front of like patrols and then trying to coax them into the minefield, and the minefield does do a decent amount of damage. Like if you can get some devastators to stumble through the minefield, it will blow them up. It's just you're not going to see as much of a benefit against the automatons as you are the Terminids. So speaking of the Terminids, I think both sets of the mines do way better now against the Terminids. Sometimes you're facing 20, 30, 40, to even 50 plus Terminids at one time, and it's just far easier to coax the Terminids into a minefield than it is the automatons. So if I was trying to defend an objective or defend extraction or something, I would throw down a minefield and all the Terminids would run in and it would just annihilate them. The increased explosive damage really makes a big difference. It was blowing the crap out of the Bile Spewers and the Brood Commanders and the Hunters, and any of the small bugs were getting absolutely wrecked. The Chargers didn't really care as much. I was able to kill a couple Chargers with the minefields, but I mean, it's a Charger. Chargers can kind of tank through most things, so I wasn't really expecting it to blow up a Charger. But both sets of mines are pretty good against the Terminids, although I would say that the incendiary mines are probably a little bit better just because it sets everything on fire, and then anything that runs through the fire is also going to die. But obviously, I'm not going to have any complaints since the only change that they made were buffs. I think it's because a lot of people just don't choose the minefields. They wanted some sort of incentive to choose them. I think the main problem with the mines is that people just always kill their teammates with the minefields because just people don't pay attention. That's one of the reasons I don't choose the mines that often, is because my friends always get really pissed at me because I'll throw down the mines and then they'll just walk into them and explode. But overall, I could tell a pretty big difference with both sets of mines, and I think they feel pretty good. So next up on the list is the Orbital Gatling Barrage. Now, they increased the rate of fire by 25%, so it's going to fire a lot faster now. They increased the rounds per salvo from 30 to 60, so you're going to get double the rounds than you did before. They increased the armor penetration, so now it can damage heavily armored enemies. And they decrease the cooldown from 80 to 70 seconds. So this is a pretty massive buff to the Orbital Gatling Barrage, and I'm all for it. This is really good at cutting off choke points, so if you're being chased by a group of enemies, or you're trying to spawn camp some bots getting dropped off from a ship, or some bugs coming out of a bug breach, this is a great stratagem to deal with those situations. Now, I do think it is better against the Terminids just because there's more Terminids to kill, but don't get me wrong, it is pretty okay against the Automatons automatons if you know when to use it, but I absolutely love using it against the Terminids. There were so many bug breaches, and I would just throw this on top of the bug breach, and it would just spawn camp the crap out of them. I would get 30 plus kill streaks over and over and over, and this thing lasts forever. Since they doubled the amount of rounds that this thing shoots off, this thing just keeps shooting and shooting and shooting. So anytime I was defending an objective, I would throw this thing down and all the enemies would just run right into it and get absolutely wrecked. Now, as for the damaging heavily armored enemies, I noticed that it does damage the heavily armored enemies, but it doesn't like absolutely wreck them. At least in my experience, I saw a couple clips on Reddit where it was like just demolishing some of the bigger enemies, and I never really got that to happen. So I'm sure it's going to vary from person to person, but I could definitely notice it was doing damage to Hulks and Chargers and stuff like that, but it will absolutely wreck things like Devastators and Brood Commanders and Bile Spewers, and that alone is enough for me to bring this thing. So overall, I really enjoy all the buffs that the Orbital Gatling Barrage received, but I highly recommend you guys bring this on a Terminid mission, throw it on top of a bug breach, and just watch the kills rack up. So on a similar note, next up I want to talk about the Orbital Airburst Strike. Now it received a decreased cooldown time from 120 seconds to 100 seconds, and this is pretty similar to the Orbital Gatling. You want to use it in pretty similar situations. If there's a bug breach or enemies are charging at you, you throw this down, the enemies will run through the airburst and, you know, they'll get pretty wrecked. And I had pretty close to the same results as I did with the Orbital Gatling. This is a pretty good stratagem to use in those situations, and obviously this is going to be a good stratagem to use now since it's only 100 seconds. You can call it in fairly often, and it is going to get you a lot of kills. So I don't use the Orbital Airburst Strike that often, but this is a pretty welcome change. So up next is one of my favorite changes in this whole patch, and it's the Orbital Precision Strike. Now they decreased the cooldown from 100 seconds to 90 seconds, and they decreased the spawn/call-in time from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. And I already really liked the Orbital Precision Strike because you could use it to kill things like Bile Titans, you could use it to blow up objectives, and now it's even better. So one of my favorite things that I like to do is throw a stun grenade at a group of Devastators or a Hulk or a Charger, and then I'll throw down this Orbital Precision Strike. It comes down in 2 seconds and it will just annihilate anything that it hits. You do have to be a little bit careful though, because I did accidentally end up blowing myself up a couple of different times because I was too close to the enemies and I didn't give myself enough time to run away. So this was already really good at taking out Bile Titans, so the fact that it only has a 2-second call-in time now is just great. So anytime the Bile Titan goes to like charge up its puke attack, I'll just throw this right underneath of it and it will just annihilate it. So I can honestly see myself bringing this on most missions going forward. It's good for pretty much every scenario, and I liked it before this update and now I like it even more. So up next is a pretty weird change. It's the Eagle 110 rocket pods. They said while these changes may look like a straight up nerf, that is not the intention, but they improve the targeting, they increase the projectile armor penetration, so now it does 100% damage to heavily armored enemies instead of 50. They decrease projectile damage from 600 to 250 to compensate for the improved targeting and extra damage from the increased armor penetration, and then they decrease explosion armor penetration so the explosions can no longer damage heavily armored enemies. And I think this change is really weird because the rocket pods feel a lot different now, and I had mixed results when I was testing this. For example, when I tried to use this against Chargers, sometimes it took 2 rounds of the rocket pods to kill 1 Charger. When I was testing it with my friend Cookie, like I hit a Charger with rocket pods and then he hit it with rocket pods and then it eventually just bled out. And that happened a number of different times. But then in other situations, I would throw these rocket pods at a Charger and it would just insta-kill the Charger. So I think it depends on the angle and where it hits at on the Charger will determine if it dies instantly or not. Same thing for automaton Hulks. I tried it against Hulks. Sometimes they died immediately in just 1 hit, and sometimes it took multiple hits. Then I tested against automaton tanks. It did insta-kill tanks every time I use it against tanks, and it did insta-kill the automaton cannons anytime I came across the cannons that are in the environment. So it feels like the rocket pods are just kind of okay. I couldn't kill things consistently enough to say that these are worth bringing. I mean, these rocket pods do have a quick cooldown time, so I mean they are good in that regard, and they are good at blowing up like robot factories and different objectives and stuff. But overall, I wasn't too impressed with these changes. I honestly felt like the rocket pods were better before this change. So to me, it feels like the rocket pods kinda got a bit of a nerf. But that's just my thoughts based off of my testing. Go test it out for yourselves, and let me know if you had any different results down in the comment section down below. So up next is the GL-21 grenade launcher, and they increased the explosion damage from 350 to 400. Now the grenade launcher supply backpack combo was one of my go-to loadouts for the Terminids. Like, it just absolutely demolished the Terminids before this update. After the update, obviously it's even better. The grenade launcher is easily one of the best stratagems you can bring to face the Terminids. It is just an absolute beast, especially when combined with the supply backpack and you can give yourself more ammo. It can blow up bug holes with ease, it can blow up the bug eggs with ease. It does struggle with chargers and bio titans though, but everything else it just completely obliterates. And since it got this buff, I found that it's actually way better now against the automatons. Before this update, I never really considered the grenade launcher for the automatons, like it was just kind of okay, but it just wasn't reliable enough for me to bring against the Devastators. And after this update, it will just straight up bully the Devastators. The only thing that it struggled with was the Hulks. Like, you have to get behind the Hulk and shoot it in the back, because trying to shoot it in the eye or shoot it at its feet, the explosive damage just doesn't do enough to take out a Hulk, but it is pretty good at damaging everything else. So I really liked the grenade launcher before, and now I absolutely love the grenade launcher. So do yourself a favor, get the GL-21 grenade launcher, combine it with the supply backpack, and go take on some Terminids. So the next stratagem on the list is the Eagle Strafing Run. Now they increase its uses from 3 to 4, and they increase the armor penetration so it can now damage heavily armored enemies. Now before this update, the Eagle Strafing Run was pretty lackluster. I never saw anyone use it, I never used it, my friends never used it, and I feel like the Eagle Strafing Run always got overshadowed by the cluster bombs. But after this update and a lot of testing, I will say that it's pretty good in a pinch. For example, if you're being chased by some Terminids and you kind of line them up all in a straight line, you can just throw this at them, and the Strafing Run will always land directly in front of you. So you have to be a bit more accurate with your tosses. And even with this increased armor penetration so that it can now damage the heavily armored enemies, I honestly couldn't tell much of a difference. It still feels like it tickles the Chargers and the Hulks and the Devastators. Like, it just doesn't do that much damage. It's just a quick little burst. It's good at taking out small bugs, so if you're being chased by a bunch of hunters and stuff, it's good at taking some of the pressure off your back. And I found that it's pretty good at pushing towards an automaton base, so if there's a small little base and there's a couple factories, just throw one of these strafing runs in and it will clear out most of the smaller robots. But for any of the medium to the big enemy types, it's just not going to do enough damage. It is nice that they increase the number of uses and it has a fast cooldown time, so you can get these off pretty quickly and frequently, but I would just say that this stratagem is just okay. I wasn't blown away by it by any means, and I might pick it on occasion, but this definitely isn't going to be one of my go-to stratagems. It's nice to see that it got some love, but I'd like to see a little bit more of a buff in the future. And now lastly, the final stratagem change that I want to go over is the Exosuits. So the XO-45 Patriot Exosuit got an increase to the projectile damage from 80 to 90. They increased the projectile damage against durable body parts from 7.5 to 25%. And then they also put in the fixes category of the patch notes that the weapons of the Exosuits are now allowed small adjustments in the angle they fire their projectiles versus their muzzle angle. This should make their weapons more accurate. And after testing both of the Exosuits, I can say that both of them feel more accurate to me. Especially the Patriot Exosuit with its rockets. The rockets actually go where I aim now, which is crazy. It felt like forever where the rockets would just completely miss your targets. Now if I'm trying to hit a bug hole, or if I'm trying to hit like a shrieker nest, or something specific, I can actually hit my targets with the rockets. Now the rockets do feel like they're underperforming, like it feels like it takes like basically half of my rockets to take out one charger. So I feel like the rockets need a little bit of an increase to their damage, because right now they feel very underpowered, but both of the Exosuits feel way better than they did before this update, and I feel like it's a pretty good change. I honestly hadn't touched the Patriot Exosuit in probably well over a month, just because of how inaccurate the rockets are, and now that they fixed that, I'm finally going to start adding the Patriot Exosuit back into my loadouts. So that is going to do it for my thoughts on all the latest stratagem changes that came in the latest update. Let me know what you guys think down in the comment section down below. If you guys made it this far into the video, then I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. This video took me so long to make, you guys have no idea. So if you made it this far into the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It helps me out in the algorithm and it helps push my channel to new people. And if you're new here, consider hitting the subscribe button and hitting the bell for notifications. That way you don't miss out on any future Helldivers 2 videos. And that is going to do it for me, guys, and I will talk to you all next time.